What's up, everybody, and welcome in to another edition of the Sitdown. As always, if you enjoy this video, please make sure you hit the like button and let me know what you think in the comment section below. Also, if you're new around here, you just haven't done it yet, you're living under a rock and seeing this video for the first time, I don't know what you're waiting for. Hit that subscribe button below now so you never miss another sit-down video. If you want more great content involving the mafia, the drug trade, and other crime, please go check out my full-length podcast, The Sit Down, presented by Barstool Sports. New episodes out every Wednesday. The link to where to find this podcast is in the description below this video. Let's get in, ladies and gentlemen, to another very interesting organized crime topic. In one of the most interesting cities over the years, outside of New York and Philadelphia and Chicago, that I've always had interest in looking into is Boston. A very interesting world of intricate criminals. Now, a lot of us know Boston for people like Whitey Bulger, but there is a very interesting Italian-American mafia that's been around for years in the Boston area. As we know, if you've ever heard of New England, you've heard of Raymond Patriarca. Today, we're going to get in, though, to a very interesting story surrounding an alleged individual that was involved with the Boston mob. The very tragic story of Peter Limone, next on Sit Down Shorts. Peter Limone was born May 7th, 1934 in Boston, Massachusetts. He would actually say himself that he would grow up on the old West End in Boston. He said he would reside at 43 Chambers Street. Now, interestingly enough, you will not find Chambers Street on a map of the West End in Boston because today Chambers Street is no more. Around the late 50s, Boston rezoned those different neighborhoods that were old school and changed them to other streets. So Chambers Street is no longer around, but it was where Peter Limone would cut his teeth. Now, Limone would say that he would be the youngest of 15 children, and his father would actually die in 1943 when Limone was just 9 years old. Now, his parents were Sicilian and came from the beautiful town of Augusta on the eastern coast of Sicily. If you know anything about Syracuse, it's a beautiful area. Augusta is a terrifically picturesque area of Sicily. Now, for Limone, he would talk about very openly that as a child and as a youth, he would work his tail off. He would start kind of as a peddler in some of the different markets around Boston. And he would say that his brothers actually owned several different businesses, one of which owned a tomato company. The other owned a fish market business of some sort. And Limone said he worked very hard growing up, but, quickly he began kind of, I think, thinking in his head that there were probably easier ways to make money. For Peter Limone, he would at one point, though, during his adult years, move to the suburb of Medford, Massachusetts, just outside of Boston. Now, it was pretty clear that though Peter Limone and other members of the West End were Italian, he would say years later that it was really just, kind of persecution because they were Italian, and that everyone in the West End that had a vowel at the end of their name was supposedly in the mafia. He would have various run-ins with the law. At one point, it was very well known, and this would continue throughout Limone's life, that he was at one point a bookmaker. It was also very open, though, that he had other businesses as well. Peter Limone was very involved in vending machines, and he also at one point owned a restaurant in Boston called Pop-Up Pietro's. So Limone was very involved with business itself, but he also had a certain criminal element that he was involved with as well. Now, it was very well known that Peter Limone would actually come up under the tutelage of Enrico Tamelio. Now, Tamelio was a higher up in the Patriarca crime family. At one point in the mid-50s, he would be named underboss of the Patriarca crime family, one under the boss of the family, Raymond Patriarca Sr. Now, I want to get in to the situation that would ultimately change Peter Limone's life forever. In 1965, this individual, Edward Teddy Deegan, would turn up dead in an alley in Chelsea, Massachusetts, an area just outside of Boston. Now, Deegan, a little background on him. Edward Deegan, at one point, an Irishman, was a boxer. He was from the West End, like Limone. It was said that Deegan was a career criminal. I mean, he had a lengthy rap sheet. He was a very good robber, kind of just petty criminal. He did a lot of things. It was very connected to a lot of different gangsters. People knew him. He was connected to the patriarchal crime family at some point. In March of 1965, Edward Deegan's body would be found shot 6 times in that alley. Now, initially, a memo would be forwarded to the National FBI office in Washington from the Boston field office within hours of this murder. It would say that 4 individuals were found around the scene of the murder, one of which was Joe the Animal Barbosa, and one of the other individuals was a man called Vincent Fleming. Now, also at the scene, allegedly, was a man called Wilford Roy French and another individual called Ronald Cassesi. Now, these 4 individuals were said to be at the scene of this murder. Now, subsequently, I want to talk a little bit about what would ultimately happen to Joe the Animal. Now, Joe the Animal Barbosa was an individual of Portuguese descent who ultimately would become a made member of the Boston mob. He was a feared robber. He was a enforcer and ultimately became a contract killer and was very much moving up the ranks of the Boston mob. Now, for Joe the Animal Barbosa, he by the 1966 would have a falling out and fought a favor in the Boston mob. At one point, he would actually be shot in the area of Chelsea, Mass. And at one point would also hear from a superior that there was a contract out on his head. Joe the Animal Barbosa would ultimately get taken down by the FBI, would ultimately flip and say, you know what? I don't want to go to jail. I'll start doing what you tell me to do. And that's exactly what happened. Even though Barbosa and other colleagues were seen at the scene, the FBI persuades these agents that were obviously and ultimately ended up being corrupt. They would persuade Mr. Barbosa to say that other people were there. And through Barbosa's own cunningness, he hated certain people and he wanted to throw them under the bus. In fact, we'll get into down the road, it was very much well known that he was looking to frame not only Peter Limone, but Enrico Temelio as well. Now, Barbosa would say that the 4 individuals that were actually there with Cassesi and French were Peter Limone. Enrico Temelio was a part of this. Louis Greco was also there, according to Barbosa, and an individual called Joe Salvati. We would find out years later that Salvati allegedly owed Joe Barbosa about $200. So Joe Barbosa had an issue with Salvati and wanted to get him back. What he would ultimately say is, under oath, Barbosa would eventually testify in early 1967 about what he said went down. He would say that in January of 1965, just 2 months before the murder of Teddy Deegan, he would say that he met with Peter Limone. Barbosa would say that Limone would tell him that Deegan had to go because he had stolen money from Limone, and that Limone said he would pay any dollar amount to have Deegan killed. He would also say that Enrico Temelio, Limone's superior, told him that the sanctioned hit was allowed and that it could go down. Barbosa would say that Limone told him that he would pay him $7,500 to kill Edward Deegan. Now, Barbosa would also claim that not only was Limone there, but also Louis Greco was there and Salvati was there. Now, Louis Greco is a very interesting individual. Greco was at one point a World War II hero. In fact, he would earn a Bronze Star for some of his work and service during World War II. That it was also known, though, after the war, Greco, who was from an area outside of Boston called Revere, was actually known as someone that moved around in the streets. And, he was involved with certain arcs of criminal element. Um, Certain people that knew Greco would say that, he wasn't kind of that, he wasn't a choir boy, if you will. In fact, one person would say, a longtime friend, that, quote, Greco wasn't an altar boy, but he did what gangsters do. When it comes to the city of Revere, he would do anything for the people here. This was his turf. Nobody would come in here and hurt anyone from Revere. Louis made sure of that. At one point, I guess it was alleged that he had a run-in with Barbosa. And then it was very well known around circles by this point. Barbosa was a fucking lunatic. Everybody knew it. Nobody wanted to deal with this guy. And at one point, it was probable that Louis Greco was involved with him. So basically, what Barbosa does is he throws these four individuals under the bus. Temelio for the one that ordered the hit, and then the other three for actually carrying it out. Now, the other two individuals involved with this case, Ronald Cassesi and Roy French, they would also be indicted on this murder as well. Now, we would actually find out that Louis Greco was actually not even in Massachusetts at the time of this hit. He was, in fact, in Florida. So it was a pretty wild situation. Ultimately, in 1968, the trial would commence for these individuals allegedly involved with the hit on Edward Deegan. Ultimately, the four individuals seen here would be sentenced to death after being found guilty in a state of Massachusetts court. Also found guilty in this crime was Roy French and Ronald Ronnie the Pig Cassesi. Now, we would find out, interestingly enough, some things about Roy French, which I'll get to in just a second. Now, ultimately, subsequent to the verdict in this case, petitions were put out there on behalf of these individuals. In fact, most people knew they were not involved with this case whatsoever. In fact, according to Peter Limone, a Deegan family letter would be sent to him actually admitting that they knew he had nothing to do with the murder of Edward Deegan. Limone and Deegan definitely knew each other. They were both from the West End. But the Deegan family themselves would say they knew Limone had nothing to do with it. In fact, none of the people involved with this had anything to do with it. It was really a pretty sad situation. Limone would head off to prison. He would basically have to realize that he would be spending the rest of his life there. For him, he was one of the first individuals in the history of organized crime that we can say actually went to prison for a murder he did not commit. Now, for Enrico Henry Temelio, he would actually die in federal or in state prison in 1985. Sadly, as well, Louis Greco, the war hero, would pass away in 1995 as well. People that knew Louis Greco would say the one thing he wanted was to prove that he had nothing to do and was not involved with this murder whatsoever. And it's a sad state of affairs that Louis Greco died because of the corruptness of the FBI Boston field office. Now, we're going to get to that in just a second. In the late 1990s, it was becoming clear that the Boston field office of the FBI was rife with a lot of corruption. In fact, in 1997, we would learn that from FBI witness and former contract killer in Boston, John Martirano. And as we know with Martirano, he was very involved with the haunts of James Whitey Bulger. We would also learn that through corrupt FBI agent John Connolly, this agency needed to be looked into a lot more. We can all wonder how much of this is actually going on in other field offices other than Boston. The FBI field office, though, in Boston was incredibly corrupt. Now, through some of the talking of John Martirano, who would ultimately become what he would call an FBI witness, he would say that in 1967, Uh, Joe Barbosa actually called him from a payphone and said that he, quote, planned to frame not only Limone, but the other individuals involved in this case. Now, the reason for that was he not only had personal issues with them, but he would say that individual, an FBI agent called Paul Rico, deliberately held evidence back and promised Barbosa immunity to lie on the men. Now, you have to ask yourself, why would Paul Rico, an FBI agent, want to do this? Obviously, we know there was no love lost between the FBI and the mafia. Rico wanted to do anything possible to bring certain members of the mafia off the street. Rico knew in open court he could never actually bring a legitimate case against certain mobsters, so he came up with this elaborate scheme to not only bust these four, allegedly, that he said that he thought they did this, but to protect people like Joe the Animal Barbosa and Vincent Flemmi, who he had a relationship with. Now, for Paul Rico, we would ultimately find all this out, and we'll get to ultimately what would happen. Now, Paul Rico was also doing some other really shady shit. He at one point would go to the two members not involved with the four involved, Wilford French and Ronald Cassese. French would say, after he was asked by Paul Rico to lie on the men, French would tell Rico, quote, "You better warm up the electric chair for me," because he wasn't going to lie on behalf of an FBI agent. Was it likely that Roy French was probably involved with the murder of Teddy Deegan? Absolutely. But what Roy French did was he took his sentence like a man and would not lie on the stand and become a federal informant or a state informant for people like Paul Rico. It just wasn't going to happen. Was Roy French a murderer? Likely. But we have to look at his ethics and honor in saying that he will not lie on behalf of the corrupt FBI in Boston, and say that we have to kind of be enamored by that in a way. Now, ultimately, 34 years later, Roy French would see the light of day. He would be released from prison. Joe the Animal Barbosa would ultimately get just a year for the 25 murders he claimed to commit. On behalf of the government, they were willing to forgive those things. In 1970, he would be released and be relocated to California, where, guess what? He committed another murder. In 1975, he would be given 5 years after he killed an individual in San Francisco. The question we have to ask ourselves is, why does the FBI do business with people like this? That's a major question. In 1975, after being released from state prison in California, Joe Barbosa would be shot outside a San Francisco apartment building. Down the road, we would hear from a member of the Boston Mafia on the murder of Joe Barbosa. Ilario Zannino, a longtime member of the Boston Mafia and higher up, would claim on wiretap that he knew who killed Joe the Animal Barbosa. He would claim that on wire, notorious hitman Joseph J.R. Russo was the man that pulled the trigger on Barbosa. Now, subsequently in the 2000s, we would find out all the corruptness that would happen with not only Paul Rico, but John Connolly and other corrupt individuals at the FBI Boston field office. There was too much evidence, and it was clear Peter Limone had nothing to do with this. But sadly, what we would find out, and as I said earlier, two of the individuals that were wrongfully convicted in this case actually died in custody, which is a real shame, in Louis Greco and Enrico Tamalio. Look, I'm not going to sugarcoat it. Were those two individuals likely involved in criminality? Yes, but they had no business dying behind a prison wall for a murder they didn't commit. We have to remember that regardless of who some of these individuals are, they have no business dying behind the federal or state prison wall for murders they didn't commit. Luckily, in 2011, Peter Limone, seen here with his family involving, as well as his wife, would walk out of state prison and his conviction would be vacated. He had spent 33 years in Massachusetts state prisons, a long time for a murder he didn't commit. He would ultimately meet with his old friend, Joe Salvati. For Salvati and Limone, they would actually sue in federal court, and all of them, including the estates of Tamilio and Greco, were awarded a settlement of $101.7 million. Now, for Peter Limone, he would be awarded $26 million. Salvati, seen on the left, would get a cool $29 million for the long time they spent in federal prison. We can also admit that I don't know if anybody on earth will do 33 years for $26 million. I guess it's a question to pose to ourselves, but I ain't doing it. Put it that way. Now, around that time, Limone would head off and spend time with his family. He would begin to have, obviously, grandchildren down the road, and he would just allegedly serve out the rest of his life in relative anonymity. Now, it was interesting, though, because subsequently, upon the release of Peter Limone, he would actually be arrested, seen here in a booking photo in 2008 for allegedly being involved with bookmaking and loan sharking. Now, the Middlesex County, Massachusetts District Attorney Gerald Leone would say that Mr. Limone was engaged in loan sharking and extortion and also ran 4 illegal gambling parlors in Middlesex County. He would be among the 20 people indicted in a grand jury investigation. Now, obviously, they would say that he was a gangster and that he never left his life of crime even after his 33-year prison sentence. The lawyer for Limone would say, quote, he's an easy target. He's Peter Limone. They would also say it's just another example of subjecting this man who's already been through a tremendous ordeal to a completely unnecessary ordeal. Now, for Peter Limone, he would ultimately plead no contest to state charges of extortion and gambling and was placed on probation for 5 years. Luckily for Limone, it was a pretty light sentence. Now, the FBI, who we have to add, allegedly committed all these sorts of crimes and did all these sorts of things. We would, though, find out that this was all truth, and people like John Connolly and Paul Ricca would go away. Now, the FBI would claim in 2009 and 2010 that Peter Limone was actually the boss of the Boston Mafia. Now, whether we believe that or not, we still have to consider the source. This was the same FBI that framed Limone for a murder he didn't commit. Do I believe that Limone was the boss of the mafia? I don't know. I'm not in the mafia. Do I speculate that he was a gangster? Absolutely. I don't think anybody would speculate that. But again, Mr. Limone had no business serving time for a murder he didn't commit. And good for the federal government for calling out these shakedown conspiracy nut jobs that were involved with this thing. Peter Limone would die in 2017 at the age of 83. He would be survived by his wife, 4 kids, and many grandchildren. I want to leave this conversation about Limone with a quote from John Martirano. According to Howie Carr, a longtime Boston newspaper reporter, he would call Martirano after the death of Limone. Martirano would respond about Limone, quote, he was a real man. He was old school, a good guy. As I said, we can argue whether Limone was a gangster, but no man should do over 30 years in prison for a murder they didn't commit, especially when certain members of a corrupt organization like the FBI frame people for things. As always, if you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button and let me know what you think in the comments below. We'll see you next time.